All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the Bretton Woods Committee's 2022 annual meeting. Thank you all for joining us today. We kicked off our annual meeting yesterday morning with a really rich discussion on global supply chains. And we also had IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva with us yesterday afternoon. And we are very fortunate to continue our discussions today with World Bank President David Malpass. Thank you very much, President Malpass, for joining us today. Always good to have you back at the Bretton Woods Committee. Good to see you, and look forward to hearing from you here shortly.
Hi, Emily. Good to be back. Thanks.
Great to have you. Before I turn it over to you and to Bill Rhodes to kick off the discussion, just want to remind the audience that we will reserve time for questions towards the end, so that if you have questions, that you please submit them using the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll collect these, and then we will call on individuals for Q&A. As we all know, there's really a confluence of crises and challenges facing global policymakers this week as they meet here in Washington and virtually for the Bank Fund spring meetings. I'm sure President Malpass has had a very busy week with a lot of challenging meetings and discussions. So we very much appreciate him taking the time to join us. So I am now going to turn it over to our very own Mr. Bill Rhodes, who will be moderating today's discussion. He's a vice chair of our board. So Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you to kick it off with President Malpass.
Thank you very much, Emily. And it's always great to talk to David at either the annual meeting or the spring meeting, because I always say that he's in the right job at the right time, given the situation we're facing today. And the last time that we left off, which was October, David, you were sharing your thoughts on the future of multilateral development finance with us. And of course, the COVID problem continues, and inflation is now soaring. We have increasing sovereign debt loads in the emerging markets. Food prices are increasing, and we have real questions about global governance and the new world order, given the situation with the war in the Ukraine. So this is a background. I would like to ask you to give your general thoughts on how you see the situation, particularly with a deterioration in inflation in the world economy and the negative impacts of this war in the Ukraine.
Yeah, thanks, Bill, and good to see you and everybody again. And I'll note for you, I'm now converted over to Twitter, so I do tweets, and it gives the actual text of my comments. So it's a way for people to follow the kind of the formal statements. It's David Malpass WBG. That's the Twitter handle. And the reason I say that is because it's been a very busy week, and I've had comments on both the global outlook, the growth outlook, and also on the various crises. We have overlapping crises. There's COVID, there's inflation, and there's the war itself, which is having its own set of ramifications. For the people of Ukraine, obviously, just a horrible loss of life and loss of housing and cities. I was in Poland and Romania last week and saw some of the refugees. There's been a huge flow into Poland and Romania and elsewhere. We, World Bank, are providing support both to Ukraine directly and then also to Moldova, which is near the front lines, and also to the refugee flows in Romania and Poland and elsewhere. To your big point, Bill, I don't love the concept of there having been a world order. I think there were balances of forces in regions around the world that stayed balanced for periods of years, and that now are heavily imbalanced in the Russia invasion of Ukraine, a horrible step by Russia that unbalances that part of the world. So as you think about multilateralism, I would rather think in terms of trying to create effective organizations that deal with the imbalances or the balance when they occur. Some of the organizations are effective and it clearly has a positive effect. But when you get right down to it, we're talking about individual countries, their efforts to grow faster and to have better living standards for their people.
One of the things I specifically want to ask you about, David, is the speech that Janet Yellen gave recently at the Atlantic Council, a very powerful speech calling for a new Bretton Woods, or at least a review of the Bretton Woods institutions. And maybe you may want to comment on that.
Not so much on her speech, but on the general concept, Bill. Bretton Woods was in 1944, so it's a long time ago. The institutions are working. You know, it's interesting, for all this time, World Bank the World Bank Group got a capital increase in 2018, and we have capital cushions in the bank that we've been drawing on for the COVID crisis, and now we'll be announcing or we're working with our board on a $170 billion additional package of commitments that we can make over the current 15-month period. And so it proves the viability of the callable capital, the paid-in capital of the IBRD, but then also we just completed the replenishment of IDA going into IDA 20. I think this is an effective process where every 3 years, and during the COVID crisis in just 2 years, we go back to the donors, explain what has happened with the money. They put grant money into IDA, and it's spent and leveraged by the World Bank Group, and it's done in an effective way. So my sense is these are two workable concepts for the world. And of course, IFC just got a capital increase, a large one, a year ago, a year and a half ago, and MIGA has a guarantee authority within the World Bank Group. So these are, to me, it's remarkable that the articles still stand up. IMF is going through its own, the quota increase process affects it. So from my standpoint, what we can look at is a world that's asking these institutions to do more. One of the big challenges is climate change, and how much of the funding for global public goods should come from IFIs, from international financial institutions. And I think that's a worthy discussion for the world to have. My own view is you have to pay for global public goods through various sources that come directly out of the advanced economies and out of both the public and the private sectors as they work toward their climate change goals and commitments. But the world can have a viable debate about whether they want to put a lot of new money into multilateral institutions for them to help pay for and finance the global public goods related to climate change.
Well, you've done a wonderful job, particularly with the question of IDA, which has been one of your real priorities. And just in general, you've mentioned the Ukraine, and I know you've allocated up to $3 billion in support for the Ukraine. What else do you think that the World Bank Group can do and should do, and particularly in line not only with the Ukraine, but with the refugee problem overlapping in Poland, Romania, etc., and Eastern Central Europe?
Yeah, thanks. So when the war broke out, and what we wanted to do was move very fast, so we were able to put together a first $1 billion package, and then I announced last week a second package of $1.5 billion, and that's working toward our original goal of $3 billion. I'm pleased to announce or to say today we're over the $3 billion that we had originally set out. That was made possible today. There was an announcement by the US of putting $500 million of grant into the multi-donor trust fund, which is an effective vehicle for the donors to transmit funding to the government of Ukraine to sustain public services. As we look forward, Ukraine's needs are bigger than that. We'll be having a meeting on Thursday. I'm co-chairing with the Prime Minister of Ukraine and with the group of supporters, the support community, to discuss how Ukraine can be financed, recognizing they're being bombed and their infrastructure is being destroyed, and there needs to be also the monthly cash flow of running a 40 million person country. So there'll be a lot of discussion of that at the meeting. I guess it's tomorrow, Thursday, and we will see various sources. Japan just today was announcing an extra $200 million of parallel financing. So what we've tried to do over the last 3 weeks, very quickly, is put together fast dispersing. We were able to put out nearly $600 million in the first couple of weeks, which is unusual. As you know, disbursements are hard to come by. You make commitments. A lot of countries make promises or pledges. You have to turn those into commitments and then turn them into disbursements. We did that very quickly for Ukraine, and we're continuing to do that process to support them. I was at the G20 meeting today where as the Russian representative began speaking, he was in virtual. Several of the countries stood up and walked out to protest the Russian invasion, and also the way the war is being undertaken by Russia.
Well, I think you're doing great work there. One of the things that is an area of special expertise of yours, and I remember when we worked together when you were at the Treasury in the Latin American debt crisis, is this whole question of these emerging market debt, really driven initially by COVID, now the war in Ukraine, and also this problem of major central banks in the developed world raising interest rates. And you were one of the first ones to really criticize the framework, that it wasn't working, and only 3 countries have really taken advantage of it. So maybe you can say a few words on what you think needs to be done there.
The G20, I think, was well intentioned in doing a moratorium in 2020 and then the common framework in 2021. The devil's in the details. In order to actually get to debt reduction, there need to be a lot of steps that are accomplished, and unfortunately, that hasn't happened yet on Chad. It was mentioned at the G20 today that it needs to get to a debt treatment. That means fully bringing in the private sector into the debt reduction process. I don't know if you recall, but unfortunately in April of 2020, when the G20 first considered these topics, it allowed the private sector to be voluntary in terms of its participation in the debt suspension initiative, which as one might expect, meant that no private sector participants actually suspended debt payments. So the countries, even the poorest countries, continued to pay to their private sector creditors in 2020 and 2021, and they've continued that. Zambia has a de facto standstill going on, but the common framework hasn't forced the issue of creating a creditors committee for Zambia. I was encouraged by the discussion at the meetings today. There was a powerful call for the creditors committee for Zambia to be formed by the end of April. So setting deadlines is a good idea, and so it may be that the creditors and the major creditors actually form a committee to look at ways to reduce Zambia's debt service and debt burden. I've argued, Bill, and maybe I learned it from you long ago, that we need to create light at the end of the tunnel for the people of the developing countries so that they will invest their own money and they'll draw in money from abroad to build their countries. And it's hard to do when there's an overhang of debt over the country. So we need, and I'm really outspoken on this. We have to have a better system of debt transparency and of debt sustainability for developing countries. Otherwise, the investment simply doesn't come in, and so they don't grow, and inequality gets worse. That's the current situation. There were powerful presentations today at the meetings here at our IMF World Bank spring meetings, powerful presentations about the urgency of moving toward a debt treatment that will reduce the debt. I can give you some of the things that we think would help. Can I do that?
Sure.
Missing so far in the common framework as it has been defined within the process in 2021, it missed having a timeline for the formation of a creditors committee. So Zambia asked for common framework, and it's 1.5 years, and they still don't even have a creditors committee. So that's one. Another is to, when you're waiting, once a country has asked for common framework treatment, their payment should be suspended. That hasn't happened. And so, for example, Ethiopia is still, even though they're in dire poverty and even hunger, they're still paying on their debt to various creditors. Sri Lanka, who is not part of this equation, but they also have been paying on their debts. And that drains the resources of the government, and means they don't have the money, the fiscal space, to be doing the public services that are needed. A third, and we've worked with the IMF on this list to expand the eligibility of countries beyond the original 75 poorest. There's clearly a middle income problem of sustainability, debt sustainability, that's missing right now. A fourth is to have a simple rule so that comparability of treatment can be evaluated and enforced. The reason this is important is because for years and years, there was a different treatment of Paris Club official creditors from the private sector creditors that favored the private sector creditors, so that they, on a net present value basis with using a common discount rate, were getting a better deal than the official creditors. So we'd like to see a simple rule and actual burden sharing among the various creditors. And then each of these is, at issue in making for a successful common framework. Let me give you two more. Engaging the debtor countries and the commercial creditors toward the beginning of the process. We've had this odd situation under the Paris Club treatment where the debtor, the country that, and the government that owes the money, is kept in a separate room and is simply handed the terms of the restructuring. And so it would be good to have the debtor involved in the discussion of debt relief, and also have the private sector early on. We have the odd situation in Chad where Glencore is a major private sector creditor and yet hasn't been in the discussions as the creditors formed the sustainability of the debt. So that would help. And then finally, a secretariat for the common framework, for the common framework. They've been operating without their own group of people trying to move this along, and whether it exists, resides in the IMF or in the IFES or in some expanded form of the Paris Club, there needs to be a secretariat, because many of these issues are pretty complicated, and we've seen that they're not making progress. So we need to break it loose and push it forward.
Well, I think all of those are very excellent points. As you know, in our last report of Bretton Woods, we recommended sort of a reconstitution of creditor committees. They are key. And as you know, that's when you and I started working together, when I was chairing all these committees in the Latin American debt crisis and the Asian financial crisis. And I think it's long overdue. And that was a key recommendation of Bretton Woods transparency paper. And the next one we're into now is the role of the private sector in relation to this. But talking about all of this, we can't get away from China, because China is not a member of the Paris Club. It's an observer. They are the largest creditor to the emerging markets. And yet it's not clear that they've embraced this whole idea of transparency. And without China cooperating fully in this area, it's going to be very difficult to move forward. And I'd be interested in your thoughts, particularly with regards to China and the recommendations you're making.
They're very important because over the last 10 years or so, they have offered a lot of loans. Many of them are non-transparent. So we've been working to try to increase the transparency in the whole system. For example, the public disclosure of all debt and debt equivalent instruments. One of the things that's gone on is as there is disclosure of a certain type of debt, then the markets are very clever and the lawyers are clever and they create something that's not exactly called debt at the current moment. It's a debt equivalent instrument. It might be a forward sale or there's all sorts of fancy processes. We're trying to have a disclosure of that. A second thing is the elimination of non-disclosure clauses in the contracts. China has, since 2014, been regularly putting non-disclosure clauses into their sovereign contracts, which makes it very difficult for people to know what the terms are, but also whether there's been an improvement. If there's a restructuring, how do you know it was a beneficial restructuring if you have a non-disclosure clause? There's the disclosure also of collateralization. As we've moved through this process over the last year and 2 years, it's turned out that China has been frequently putting escrow accounts. I lost my word. Escrow accounts into their contracts, which means that the money flows to them, and then they give the balance back to the seller, let's say, of oil. That creates a great deal of difficulty if you're trying to work through a restructuring process. So we're trying to get countries, the developing countries, to be aware that if they're offering collateral, they may not be getting paid well or be getting as good a deal as they probably need to for the people of the country. Bill, this is complicated because there's a conflict of interest between the sitting government, which wants money now, cash on the barrelhead,
right,
versus the people of the country who are going to have to pay the contract for the next 20 years. We're seeing this situation where the government enters into a 20-year contract that's a really good deal for the private sector, for the lender, but not for the people of the country. And so we need to have disclosure. So that brings me to the relationship with China. We work with them closely. They're the second biggest shareholder in the bank. We have good relations. And what I perceive going on in China is they're recognizing that there are a lot of parts of this. China's become a strong global economy. And so it's at a moment where they could change direction and have lending processes that are closer to international standards. And that would be beneficial to China. They get a lot of benefit from having good, solid growth in their borrowing countries. And so we would like to push that forward. They spoke today at the meetings. They were constructive. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that we're at a point where China perceives it as in their interest to begin to take more responsibility within the restructuring process. To put it very candidly, what we're talking about is if they're the big creditor in a given relationship with a country, would they step up and be the chair of the creditor committee in order to work out a debt treatment? These are dynamics, Bill, that you understand better than anybody in the world, that if you're the one that's owed the most money, you need to be in the room working on how to work it through. Otherwise, what the risk is that China, as countries run into roadblocks, that they cut a bilateral separate deal for restructuring just one part of the debt. And that ends up being that actually subtracts or it's not a maximizing kind of equation. So we're working with China in a friendly way to say this is going to be a better approach if you allow the world to work with you on a restructuring process that creates light at the end of the tunnel.
I couldn't agree with you more. And of course, the case in point now is Sri Lanka, which had one of these agreements, which was not disclosed, and they are in trouble again. So I think this is an opportunity for China to show that it is really willing to open up and be part of the process, to be a stakeholder, because as the world's second largest economy and the largest creditor to the emerging markets, it suits them really to show that they are a valuable stakeholder. Wouldn't you agree?
That's right, and that's a good example. So, and this harks back to the Latin debt crisis of what happens to new money. So if you were considering putting in new money to Sri Lanka, you would have the problem that the payments to China are so large, they would take away the benefit. If we turn it around and say, okay, what would be good for China in this situation? It would be to come to a debt treatment that created some upside potential, and then that would make China's previous loans better credits, but it would also invite new money to come in. So I think people are thinking about how to get through this process. It's such a dramatic situation in many of the countries where China is the major creditor and has within its ability to help move the country forward in a way that benefits China and benefits the country. And that's what we would like to see happen.
Well, I think that's a great way to push it. On a final point, since we're talking about China, which is the world's second largest economy, as we know, people are very concerned about a slowdown there because of the property sector, the shutdowns of Shanghai, their largest port, with COVID. Are you at all concerned in your forecasts that China may not be able to grow at the 5.5% that they put up at their target, and really could help drag down the world economy in general if they fall much below that?
Of course, I'm concerned about countries in the current global environment, countries in general, because there's so many stresses on the system. In the case of China, they've been very successful at exporting into the demand-led growth that the advanced economies have been undertaking, and so that's boosted their economy. And so the forecasts have come down, but not all that much for China. The shutdowns that are hitting them now affect the supply chain, and so it's going to have. I'm worried about the downstream consequences for the rest of the world from the shutdowns going on in China. One point I'd make, Bill, or markets are pretty sensitive to risk. The Chinese currency has been strong. And can I digress for a minute? I've put a lot of emphasis on the success that China had with creating a strong and stable yuan. They did that in 1993, and it has underpinned their growth ever since because investors are willing to come in because they see the potential for investing into a currency that holds its value and that pays interest, maybe interest that's higher than offered in other parts of the world, but that has allowed China to have this really high investment rate. So I would like to see lots of changes in China in the structure of its state-owned enterprises and more reliance on private sector growth. But as we look at it, it's been stable enough during these huge stresses that the world's gone through. I worry some as they survived and went through the 2008 global financial crisis, and in many ways did better than others. That reinforced in China's mind that at least the political leaders of China like the structure that they're running. And so as as we look for the world, it would be good to have the rules-based system of the world converge into more common practices. I'm not sure we're moving quickly enough in that direction. One thing I'm digressing again, but remember, their central bank is doing what I'll call counter-cyclical policy. They're able to lower their reserve requirement in the face of the current slowdown. So they have tools that are no longer available in the other major central banks because there's no reserve requirement. So there's no lowering of the reserve requirement in the U.S., Japan, ECB, or England. So as China does that, that allows them to push more credit in when the economy slows, and vice versa. They take it out when the economy is overheating. And so that particular part of their system does seem to be working. I would like to see us find a way to recover the process in the other central banks where there is where the money, bank reserves itself provide some part of the restraint on credit growth. That way you could have a counter-cyclical monetary policy, which is hard to do under the current tools.
Well, just as a final point, since we're talking about the People's Bank of China, their central bank, they seem very advanced on a digital currency, and maybe you could make a few final comments on digital currencies and how you see the work of the World Bank in the climate area before we open it up for questions.
Okay, so cyber and crypto and climate. So on what as you know better than me and any of us, the competitiveness of banks is in part based on the settlement, the time it takes to settle. And so as China puts in a digital currency, one thing they're trying to do is get ahead on the time of settlement and the cost actually of settling transactions and cross-border transactions. So I think one lesson to take away is the other central banks need to move very quickly to lower the cost of their cross-border settlements. So China's been, they shut down the Bitcoin kind of operation in China. I think that made sense because Bitcoin, it's hard to see that was in the interest of China to use all of this electricity that was coming out of coal-fired power plants in order to produce something that really doesn't have value within their productive economy. So they've been a little bit forward-looking on that. And these are topics that are discussed in the Financial Stability Board and in other international forums. So I think there are people a lot more engaged in this than I am. Let me turn to climate. The challenge, this is a big issue for the world. The global community is looking for ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. What we did in our climate change action plan a year ago was to put that front and center. We said we want to find a process where you can integrate climate and development for countries, and that allows them to prioritize the emissions reductions that they are going to undertake. And so if you think about Vietnam, they're still building new coal-fired power plants, and they have agreements under the Paris Agreement to look for other approaches. So what I think the world needs is diagnostics that help prioritize the areas for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This, of course, applies also to adaptation, which affects a lot of the poorest countries. So on GHG emission reduction, you can look at the methane emissions. Those count more heavily in as a greenhouse gas. And there are commercially viable ways to reduce the leakage of methane from natural gas pipelines. So we can encourage that. World Bank can finance some of this, but we have to recognize that a vast amount of the funding needs to come from the global community, because you're basically buying a global public good. You're doing something that you as a global community want, and so you need to invest in that. We are looking for facilities and ways to pool the resources of nonprofits, of governments, and of private sector stakeholders within this, so that there can be enough funding to, for example, to decommission coal-fired power plants. Thanks.
Well said. And I think I'll now turn it over to Emily, because we have a little time for one or two questions. And again, I think you're doing great work at the World Bank, and the World Bank and the international community is very fortunate to have you with your experience in this particular job at this particular critical moment for the world economy. So Emily, I'm going to turn this back to you.
Thank you, Bill. And yeah, thank you, President Malpassa. No shortage of things to discuss today and challenges facing us. We do have several questions, so let me turn to a couple. First, I'm going to turn to Frank Vogel. Frank, do you want to go ahead and pose your question to President Malpass?
Oh, thank you very much indeed. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Okay. President Malpass, good to see you. Good to see you, Bill and Emily. Bill opened today with pointing out that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has raised fundamental issues about the global order. And President Biden has put it in the context of the challenge of autocracy against democracy. Doesn't this pose fundamental issues for you at the World Bank, as most of the borrowing countries from the bank today are autocracies? Thank you.
Thanks, Frank, and hello. And before I answer that, I did want to say thank you to Bill Rhodes and also Bill Dudley for the op-eds and the Bretton Woods Committee spots on debt transparency and sustainability. This is an important topic for the world, as we were just discussing. Frank, coming to this question. The World Bank's articles were created in 1944, at the time when the world was in turmoil and not thinking very much in terms of there being democracies versus autocracies. So from the standpoint of the World Bank, what we want to do is find good development practices for people and not look at the formation of their government. We want to have non-corrupt governments that benefit the people of the countries, and we work in that direction. We have a governance practice that tries to improve the governance the types. But for example, we aren't going to look at a country and say that the head of state can only stay for 8 years and can't extend their term and become autocrats. That the issue is, how do they get benefits in terms of poverty alleviation and also in terms of higher living standards for their people, and broadly construed. That means living standards in terms of standing against violence against women, standing against intolerance within their countries. How do we push that forward within their practices on a broad standard of better living standards for the people of the countries? Thanks.
Thanks, President Malpass. We're going to go from corruption to inflation, and I'm going to ask Teresa Kong to please unmute herself and pose her question. Teresa?
Thank you so much, Emily. David, you were one of the first economists to identify that China was going to be a major deflationary force driving down deflation since 2000. You were head of Bear Stearns then, and you came to our office and you called it. What do you see unfolding over the next 2 decades, given what we're seeing in terms of increasing regionalism, as well as other factors as we speak, coming from COVID, as well as commodities supply shocks right now? Thanks.
Thank you, Teresa. This is a really important question. Remember all those years in 2000, 2005 through 2018, when people were wondering why is inflation so low, and one part of that answer was that China was a disinflationary force because they were bringing on, part of it was demographics, part of it was overinvestment in export industries, and so you can think of it as loss leaders by China as they took market share from other countries. Some of it was anti-competitive. Some of it, I think, was that in 2010, 11, 12, the QE, what the central banks were doing was not as stimulative as they made it out to be. I've argued that simply expanding your balance sheet is not really stimulative, nor is shrinking your balance sheet. And I don't think that by itself is actually a tightening of monetary policy. It's a big change in the allocation of capital. So that takes me to your question. If we say over the next 20 years, is the world going to have a disinflationary or an inflationary bias? It matters a lot whether capital is allocated well to create the goods and services that drive down prices. It's really very important what the supply reaction is of the world to the current price spike. And an important part of that is what happens on energy. Energy is the base for creating fertilizer, which is the base for creating food crops. And so this is an important moment for the world in terms of, will it create more, how will it allocate capital to the expansion of energy? I was just in Poland. One question that's very present in Poland is the grid itself. How do you get enough base load onto a grid that was built, say, in the 1950s or 60s, a long time ago, and is not able to absorb properly the renewables that maybe a market pricing would put in more renewables, but if you don't have the grid up to standards, it's hard to then insert that. So does the world invest in new grids? Does the world invest in new pipelines for natural gas, recognizing that that's a cleaner fuel than the alternatives? In Africa, a lot of the countries, because of the unavailability of natural gas, right now are burning more diesel fuel and also HFO, heavy fuel oils, bunker fuel. I met earlier this week with the president of Madagascar. They're burning heavy fuel oils in a country that's where the biodiversity is a key part of their competitiveness going forward because of tourism, but they're burning bunker fuel to make electricity. So I'm sorry that was a roundabout answer, but in the early 2000s, there was this giant thing going on in the world. China, with a stable currency, was investing very heavily in new industries that drove down prices. That was disinflationary. Now we have to say, okay, what would that new concept be? There's talk in Europe, and the European Union is changing stance on nuclear power. And there are in some circles talk of fusion power, other innovative technology there, and of course cleaner ways to create giant amounts of renewable power. And so those will be some of the tests. The alternative, and we can be cautious, is if you expend a lot of money on things that don't actually bring benefits, then that's going to be that's not going to be disinflationary. It will be inflationary, and that is this misallocation of capital concern that I have. That unless we can have capital that's allocated by some kind of competitive force, market forces and regulation that permits capital to go to small businesses, it's hard to see how we get out of the current inflation spiral. Thanks.
Thank you, David. And I think we're just about at time. We do have a lot of other questions. So I'm gonna maybe just ask one final question about food prices and food insecurity. And Secretary Yellen was convening the G20 and a lot of global leaders at a summit this week. So wanted to hear a little bit. I know our audience is interested in what the bank is doing on that, and what are some of the outcomes from that.
Yeah, thanks. So I was in that meeting yesterday with Secretary Yellen, and the U.S. is leading a lot on trying to address the crisis early. The World Bank puts roughly $17 billion per year into food security. That includes somewhat the social safety nets. So one point, I'll leave you with 2 points on that, and then if there's time, we can do another. It's that we need lots more supply of food and of fertilizer, and countries need to come together and do that, or allow that to happen. And more open markets are critical to this. It would help if the US lowered some of its tariff and quota barriers. I was pleased to see yesterday India digging into its stockpiles and begin shipping. They have a lot of extra wheat in India, so that can smooth over some of this food price spike. So I think there are tools the world can use. It needs to deploy those tools fast now in order to avoid a bigger crisis.
Yeah, something we'll all be watching for sure. We are at time, and I'm sure you have many
Hey,
pressing engagements today. So I want to thank you very much. Thank you, Bill Rhodes, very much for moderating today's conversation, and to our audience, and fantastic questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. Our annual meeting will continue tomorrow. We have a action-packed agenda tomorrow, so hope to see you all online then. Once again, thank you, President Malpass. Thank you, Bill Rhodes. We'll see everybody tomorrow.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Bill, and bye to everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.